recording now. Right, welcome everyone to join our webinar. We have 3 speakers today, including myself and Hongwei and Jinyan. I will introduce them respectively. But first, I want to invite Echo Tang, our founder of the CILENS project, to introduce a bit about what we've been doing in the last few months and what this theme project is about. So Echo, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Yun. Okay, I'll just start. This webinar is actually the first webinar of the CILENS project, which is something I started around in this March, and then this June we have started this program focusing on the Chinese feminism as well as LGBTQ movement as a way, to address the Pride Month and the current situations in China. So now I will do a short presentation using my slides, and I will share my screen. Sorry, just give me 1 second. All right. Can everyone see my screen now? I think so. Okay, great. This will be short. So CILENS is basically, as you can see here, Chinese indie cinema in Berlin. It's an Berlin-based nonprofit film curation project that I sort of officially launched in this March. It explores the idea or the concept of how to use cinema as a public space. And in this public space, we can talk about a lot of important things. We can also work towards creating connections through the screenings and the dialogues. Yes. So, and the sort of curatorship scope is focused on showcasing Chinese independent or art house films that are really exhibited. And we actually also have an agenda focus, which is to explore socio-political issues regarding women, migration, and urbanization that are represented in Chinese filmmakers' works. And I personally believe that this could be a great way to unfold these complex realities of contemporary China with some insider perspectives that will challenge a Eurocentric view, since we are now in Europe and we are, surrounded by this kind of view, and provide an insight into understanding major facets of the experience of Chinese women, queer people, rural migrant workers, ethnic minorities, and possibly more. So far, we have this Instagram account that's been gradually growing. And also we are featured on my mentor institution's website, ZKU. So what have we done specifically? Well, the first screening event took place on the last day of April in a place at the city center of Berlin, and we actually showed the documentary film of the female poet Yu Xiuhua, who I think a lot of you have already been familiar with, and we also set up a very interesting and lovely, I would say, exhibition of some of her works. So it looks like this on that night, and we unexpectedly had many more people than the normal capacity, which should be 50, but we ended up having 70 people for the first time. So it was really a surprise for all of us, for the teamwork, and we had the audience profile since then is usually have Chinese and have non-Chinese audience, which is such a great reflection on the diversity of Berlin itself. And this month, as I just briefly mentioned, we have this film curation program, feminist and LGBTQ activism in contemporary China. But first of all, we we exhibited 3 films offline, also in the city center of Berlin, which has happened last week. But in order to engage more people, Yun as a co-curator said we should, do this webinar as we are having now. And we have the webinar, and we also just had the online screening of the 3 documentaries on our partner Catholic Play. So we believe that in this way, we not only could we engage more audience, but this webinar itself is also, I guess, the process of generation and sharing of knowledge, and it's also a great way to kind of create a community where people have similar concerns for this agenda. And here are some photos for last week's offline programs. We were also very fortunate and happy to have Popo come, who is now a Berlin-based Chinese queer filmmaker, and who is also the director of one of our documentaries in the program. So I guess this is a very new project, but now what we expect is that we look forward to meeting viewers from diverse backgrounds who would bring along their own experiences, emotions, and perspectives into the cinema. And together we can co-create this community of mutual understanding and solidarity. So please feel free to follow us up on Instagram or Facebook. We also have the WeChat account, 微信公众号, which is also called CILENS 柏林华语影展. And we have a Telegram group, which is also welcome for everybody to join. I guess that's all from my side. Thanks again, Ying and everyone.
Hi, thank you, Echo. I have to say it's very impressive how the project of Silence has developed so quickly. I met Echo only in April this year for the first time, and she already did 2 offline screenings in Berlin, one that's on catholic.com, and more events are coming. It also shows that there is a need for viewers and also Chinese living abroad and within China to share this kind of experiences with independent films, independent cinema. So I think it's a very valuable project. I'm very glad to be the co-curator of this online webinar. To start our presentations today, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers. So I sent the short bio of the 3 speakers in the chat, and that's also how our presentation are going to take place today. It will be both in English and Chinese. We try to be as inclusive as possible. So most of us, Hongwei and Jinyan, we will speak in English. Our PowerPoints will be mostly English with some Chinese kind of captions. But we have 3 wonderful translators with us today, and they will try to summarize our messages in Chinese as well. So you can follow the Chinese kind of translation in the chat box. So as recommended by Hongwei, I will start today's presentation, which will be followed by Jinyan and then Hongwei himself. And I'd like to give the short introduction to each of the speakers before their presentation. So let me share my screen. So myself, my name is Zhou Yunyun. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo in Norway. So I'm quite kind of in this Nordic region. I'm doing research on China's gender and politics. So today I'd like to bring us to a general discussion first about how should we understand feminist and queer documentaries in the Chinese context. I'd like to look into a bit of the categories and different modes of documentary that are already existing. And then I'd like to pose the question about the limit or the boundaries of documenting or observing reality, and whether social movements should go beyond that when they use documentary in themselves. So firstly, I think we cannot circumvent the definition of the so-called feminist and queer documentary, since that's the subject of our today's discussion. I have taken into account different scholars' discussions, and those have been also quite extensively written and discussed by Jingye and Hongwei themselves in their ongoing research work. I'd like to propose at least 3 different criteria that we can use to define a documentary as either feminist or queer. So the first criteria I'd like to bring us to attention is the fact that generally a feminist documentary or queer documentary has a conscious affinity to the social movement that they belong to. Let it be a feminist or queer movement. So this kind of affinity could be a textual affinity or kind of aesthetic affinity or geographical or organizational affinity. So by that, we mean that the director, the filmmakers themselves might be more or less kind of aware and acknowledging the fact that they belong to a certain movement. So one of the simplest way to identify a documentary might be simply discuss with the director about their identity, what kind of social political groups they think they belong to, what kind of, whether do they actually believe they belong to the movement that their films might be about. So that's the first criteria I think we should consider. And the second criteria is that the documentaries should contain the visual representation of the life experiences of women and sexual minorities, as well as their identities, their point of views, and also the kind of social, societal, structural inequalities they face. And that's quite crucial for the definition of feminist or queer documentary. As sometimes we can see other groups such as male directors or non-feminist, non-queer directors might also film subjects that are women or queer groups or different socially marginalized groups, but they don't necessarily take their point of view. They don't really go into their inner worlds, or they don't demonstrate their the obstacles they're facing in a way that there is a chance, there's opportunity of objectifying those subjects. So that links to the third criteria I think Jingye will talk more about today, is the fact use reflexivity, the so-called 反身性, and the so-called feminist ethics of care in the documentary in order to avoid objectifying or exploiting or even reproducing discrimination against the social groups that you are depicting in your films. So I think with those different criteria, of course, there are room for discussion, and I welcome the audience to give us your point of view as well. How do you understand feminist documentaries or queer documentaries? Do you think there are certain criteria that we need to add into this definition? I think you can definitely message us. So during the presentations, if you have any comments or questions, please write to Echo Town directly. She will be collecting all of your comments because when we talk, it's a bit difficult to read your chat messages. So moving on from definitions, I think when we talk about feminist documentary and queer documentary in China, we also need to understand a bit of the typologies. So drawing from American scholar Bill Nicholas' kind of categorization of documentaries, I think the idea is that there's no one way to define or categorize documentaries. On the left side, you can see that there are different narrative models. On the right side, you can see documentaries have different kind of modes of narrating. So those two ways of defining or categorizing documentaries are not mutually exclusive. You can be some of the left part, some of the right. It can be multiple at the same time. So, but what you can see is that on the left side, the so-called investigation model, advocacy model, history model, or even diary model, biography model are often similar to nonfiction writings. So in a way that the documentary text can be seen as a kind of, they correspond to nonfiction writing modes. So it's almost kind of production of different texts with a visual element. And I will go more into details and give you examples for this. And on the right side, I think it's also commonly understood that there are different approaches to portray your story, be it a diary or a biography. And those 6 different modes are often considered to be observational, expository, poetic, reflexive, performative, and participatory. And again, those categories should not be seen as way to limit filmmakers or audience interpretations of the films. For me, they're tools to remind us that when we look at certain films, there can be a mixture of different elements in them. And especially in the Chinese context, I think those categorizations helps us to interpret those films by looking at those different modes they use. So to give you a few examples, this film I have screened in my own feminism class in Norway, and it has really captured students' attention. Hooligan Sparrow is a documentary made by director Wang Nanfu, who was studying film documentary making in New York. And the main protagonist, one of the main protagonists, was Ye Han-yan. She was a sex worker rights advocate, but also she was involved in the child sexual abuse case in Hainan in 2013. I think mainland audience might be familiar with this case. So to relate this example to the categories I just mentioned, I would say that Hooligan Sparrow uses investigation and testimonial models of narrating, as it mainly focuses on Ye Han-yan's own personal reflections of her background, of her story, her motivations of doing such activism, but also it investigates how her activism unfolds and what the consequences were after her activism in Hainan, and then she was chased by police to different regions, and she couldn't even find a place to stay. So in a way that it's a very typical investigation mode of documentary, that the director follows the protagonist into this thread of story, and then try to review what are the different actors and what is happening and why it's happening. So, so those are the kind of left-hand models of narrating. And if we think about the on the right hand, what I showed about the modes of documentary, I would argue that Hooligan Sparrow is a quite typical reflexive and participatory modes of documentary. By saying reflexive, I mean that the director Wang Nanfu has consciously chosen to present herself as not only an outsider, or actually not at all an outsider, but rather a direct participant of Ye Han-yan's activism. So Wang Nanfu was following Ye Han-yan throughout the whole process. And she was also similarly chased and investigated and threatened by police together with Ye Han-yan. And quite touchingly, she shows her own fear and her own emotion during the whole process of filming and interacting with the police and Ye Han-yan. So in that way, it's a very good example of reflexive kind of documentaries. By participatory, I mean that simply Nanfu has very much engaged, interacted with Ye Han-yan throughout the process. To give you a few more examples, definitely not it's definitely not a complete list. Some of the Chinese queer documentaries tend to use group profile or biographic approaches in their narrating. So By China, Shuang, directed by Wei Tingting, is a good example for this kind of group profile mode of narrating. By group profile, it's quite can be simply understood as 群像影片. So the film selects a few different bisexual individuals, and they let them tell their stories in front of the camera, and they tend to demonstrate how they are approaching their bisexuality in reality. So in terms of modes of documentary, this one is more like an expository. So in a way, it's more explaining how a phenomenon is taking place in China. For example, how the group of bisexuals are living, are experiencing both their inner worlds and outside world in China. So that's one example. Another one is one of the films that we have been screening both in Berlin and online on catheplay.com is the film about lesbian activism in China since 1995. So 我们在这里, it's a quite a good example of historical models of narrating and also testimonial, meaning that they tend to look back into history to trace how different, how should I say, to trace how events unfold, who are the most significant actors. And they also tend to explain to the audience what is lesbian activism in China, how did it start? So in a way, it's also expository. So another example of this kind of testimonial would be produced by Jin Yan, the documentary called Outcry and Whisper, 喊叫与耳语. In a way, it also collects different individual female workers, including her own memories of resistance, of violence, of healing as well. But what's different in Jin Yan's 喊叫与耳语, I would argue, it has a more poetic, kind of more essay feature in it. So by poetic, it means there's a lack of coherence of time and space. The montage might be more cut, and they are assembled in a more in a way that the first element and second element might not be necessarily coming together to create a poetic sense. So I would say this kind of poetic and essay style documentaries are less seen in China's feminist and queer documentary. The other modes, such as more expository and observant and profile focused and more biography focused approach is more it's more common. And last example would be Fan Bobo's 新前门大街, which Hong Wei has really extensively analyzed in his writing. So in this film, it has a more performative and participatory feature, because they invited two homosexual couples to kind of march in Beijing, in Xinjiang area. And they recorded this process, and not only the protagonists themselves, but also how the audience, without any, of course, preparation, how they viewed, how they reacted to such events. So in a way that kind of performativity, and even challenging the fact that documentaries cannot be performed or has to be non-fictional. I think that's a very interesting play with the boundary and definition of documentaries. So moving towards the end of my talk, I want to raise the question that it's a more common understanding that documentaries should be the observant, should be the fly on the wall, simply recording reality. So the question is that enough? If among all the different modes of documentary, the observant mode is as only one of them, is it enough to, for social movements especially, to really realize their goal? So to use the quotation from feminist film theorist Claire Johnston, she says, what the camera in fact grasps is the natural world of dominant ideology. And in that ideology, women's cinema cannot afford such idealism. The truth of our oppression cannot be captured on celluloid with the innocence of the camera. It has to be constructed or manufactured. New meanings have to be created by disrupting the fabric of male bourgeois cinema with the text of film. So by using this quote, I want to say that I think if looking at the currently existing feminist and queer documentaries, we can see that already different modes, different narrating models exist, and there's a quite nice mixture and quite a variety of those different modes. But that also tells us that sometimes documentaries are not only used to record reality, because by recording reality itself, the film itself might be simply only reproducing the hierarchies that exist in the reality. So sometimes it's also good, it's also useful to go beyond merely the fly on the wall mode, but instead to use documentary as creative tools to reimagine the reality, to challenge the reality, and to draw fantasies and poesies and fictions into the documentary practice. So that's the last bit of my talk. I want to bring a few examples to push our understanding of documentary forward. So when we think of documentaries, we often think it has to be a produced, a finished production of a film. But nowadays, if we talk about 纪实影像, in English, it's a bit hard to translate. We talk about this with Jingyan and Hongwei. We think it can be simply documentary materials or documentary footages. And those are even a bigger category than documentary films. There are three examples I want to bring. The first one is Wang Zheng's series of oral history interviews with leading feminist figures in 2000s. So after the 1995 World Women's Conference, and she uploaded that to the digital archive of University of Michigan. So such records of interviews, of oral history, of walking head videos, it's also precious form of documentary videos. Another one would be the ongoing, China's ongoing Me Too movement, and people, all of us are following a few significant cases, such as Jing Yao and Xian Zi's cases. So for those cases, feminist media channels such as Huizhen Xihua, they record and they publish videos that show the latest update of those Me Too cases, of their court result, of their public hearing details. And those videos, I argue, are also very important documentary footages. They might not be films, but they are important 纪实影像 in order to sustain the movement, to secure the knowledge and history in the movement. So last example would be a very nice documentary video made by overseas journalistic platforms called whynot.com. And this documentary film published last year really nicely summarizes a few different pioneers of China's feminist movements and their current situations. So in a way, it's not, it wouldn't be necessarily categorized as a documentary film, but such documentary videos, I argue, are also quite crucial, and we have to pay attention to them when we think about China's feminist and queer documentaries. So that's my talk today. Sorry for going a bit over time. Right, I'd like to present then Jin Yan and Jin Yan's talk. So Jin Yan is a postdoctoral fellow at Lund University, and herself is also a writer and documentary filmmaker. She earned her PhD at the University of Hong Kong in 2017, and Jin Yan specializes in gender and sexuality, culture and politics, intellectual identity, and social activism and ethnicity in China. So Jinyan is here with us, but she has a pre-recorded version of her talk. I will play this video.
Thank you, Ying. Sorry, I connected everyone from to mobile phone while I'm traveling, so that's why I pre-record my speech. Thank you, Ying. Please. Hi, thank you, Ying, for organizing such a wonderful webinar. So today I'm going to talk about designing feminism in Chinese documentary, which 中国独立纪录片的女权欲望 which based on several articles I recently wrote. One of the article was published on Chinese Independent Cinema Observer. You can have open access to on the CIFA's website. The other articles are coming up soon and reviewed. So before I talked about these documentary films on the list, I would like to briefly introduce my approach of studying feminist documentary from the feminist point of view. So I used to adopt a Foucauldian approach, which and being informed by the studies of desire in Chinese society in Hong Kong, such as Lisa Raphael's Designing China book, and Hossein and Zheng Jiada's book on sex and desire in Hong Kong. In 2016, I worked with Hossein to curated a series of Designing China documentary screening and discussions at the University of Hong Kong. So this series was intended to explore the discipline of sex as the deployment of social powers on individuals, and the desire is seen as a resistant power that transforms oneself and reforms the society one is living in on screen. So in my study, my Foucauldian inquiry centers not only on the power relations among documentary participants, but also on scrutinizing the reproduction of power structures in intellectual activity and the representation politics, distinguishing the seizure power as well as partnership and resistance as positive power or positive forces. Also, I conducted reflexive conversations with documentary participants, including to filmmaker, protagonists, and all both identity holders, to open up spaces for examining key ethical concerns in Chinese independent documentary films, including the treatment of protagonists before, during, and after filming, the question of informed consent, solidarity, and the filmmakers' commitment to activist causes, and the ethics of distribution and exhibition of films about domestic violence and other types of abuse, and general concerns about the balance between privacy and public right to know. These conversations have addressed the complexity of documentary participants' positions, while privacy, like inner, personal, family, and 私 means profit, 私利, or immoral desires, 私欲, not appropriate for the public to view. And to also including the dealing with trauma, pain, which are represented in documentary films. So in my research, I adopt a feminist point of view to understand sex, gender-based violence, and the representation of female subjectivity in documentaries, and address the filmmakers' concern on ethics. My feminist perspective, I will argue that differentiate from in the gendered asymmetries of representation in the ethos of masculinity and the domination, even in the documentaries and literature regarding subtle or vulnerable groups, such as in the ethical controversy of Maisho wheat harvest. This approach recognizes femininity and the experience of disadvantaged documentary participants in the representation and reasoning. So I wish, you will read my article. So I don't go to many details, but I would like to highlight a few examples of this film being screened during Designing China feminist Designing China film screenings. For example, the Hooligan Special, which also Designing China screening poster used the Ye Haiyan, the arcade Hooligan Sparrow's protest photo as the main visual for the advertisement event. So in the documentary film Hooligan Sparrow, it's about actually feminist fight, feminist solidarity between the activists and netizens, and also between the filmmakers and on the screen, but also off screen, to fight against the child sexual abuse and the political hunting of activists. So the filmmaker edited her own the story of documentary filmmaking in the process of documenting activist fight against child sexual abuse. So this filmmaking became one of narrative in the film. Through this way of filmmaking, the feminist fight of protagonist men, protagonist hers, and the protagonist theirs become a fight of ours in solidarity with support and care to each other, also on screen and off screen. I would like to particular to mention that there's the video documentation Ai Weiwei's interview with Ye Haiyan on August 26, 2010, which I will say the interview for short was met in 2010, but it was released on YouTube on June 3rd, 2013 during Ye Haiyan's detention. This is a talking head style, the video documentation, but very powerful, with the questions were presented as subtitles in the video. So which makes the film, the documentation, video documentation, more or less like Ye Haiyan's monologue as a self-confession. So in the interview, I will argue that it's somehow Ye Haiyan's nuanced video love letter to Ai Weiwei, sharing her self-understanding of the separation of mind and body while doing sex work, a message about her ability to keep herself autonomy and her desire to look for a soulmate like Ai Weiwei, the imaged and the actual relationship between interviewer and interviewee pushed Ye Haiyan to present her innermost authentic self during the video interview, which creates a very intensive appeal to the interviewer, and also audiences. She became, in a way, a confessor in this semi-personal and semi-public video letter under Ai Weiwei's gaze, of course. But also, I want to highlight Ye Haiyan's confession in the interview is very powerful because it adopts an angel empowerment approach and depicts grassroots women's collective suffering and their vulnerability to sexual violence in particular. Ye Haiyan's position of appeal is grounded in demonstrating women's agency in recognizing female desire, female pleasure, dealing with sexual violence, and establishing their own autonomy, though they experience lots of traumas and violence. So through experience, they experience violence and sexual violence and facing discrimination. Ye Haiyan, a woman like her, she demonstrates she is able to heal and to organize others for self-help and support each other, and also to mobilize the public for social change and to advocate equality for everyone, girls, women, and sex workers in particular. And also with on the Designing China screening series, we screened a film about extramarital relationship. And so Yang Lina, the film director of The Love Life of Law, reflected that even though the film's protagonists do not mind if I screen the film, however, I am clearly aware that their understandings about media are different from ours. They are not aware of the power of dissemination. So while the protagonists choose to show the public their immoral positions, they provoke the public or intend to legitimize their controversial practices from their own perspectives. This perspective often contradicts the interests of other protagonists, such as the wives of those having extramarital relations. So if filmmaker acts in the interest of the one protagonist, it may have negative consequences for the other protagonists, or often both. So the filmmakers, both Lian Qi and Lao An, A Sound of Love, maybe, they used the strategy of develop the documentary by showing the footage and editing to protagonists in the process of editing to gain the mutual consent understanding of how to develop that documentary film, and also control the distribution of these two films to reduce the impact on the protagonist. And the other documentary film, Nightingale, not the only voice, because the protagonists are also filmmaker. So parents does not like their on-screen image. So the film was not screened to the public for 15 years. And after 15 years of personal life changes, communication, and director and protagonist self-transformation, on self-understanding, on domestic violence and family history, family practice during the Cultural Revolution and the land revolt, family history, the impact on the nowadays family relationship, etc. So the filmmaker eventually agreed to screen the film again for the first time after 15 years. About 15 years of not screening it. So I won't go to details, but yeah, again, you are most welcome to read my article. And also, I would like to address two films, 姐姐 by Hu Xinyi and My Soul by Xu Tong, which were not screened the film during the Designing China screening discussions, but also very important for discussion in terms of its content, etc. So 姐姐, the film sisters details the tensions of a mother-daughter relationship and when a teenage daughter who used to live with the Chinese father and Japanese stepmother in Japan, China, is newly arrived in the US to live with her mother and the American stepfather. So and during the process, the mother's memories of experiencing long-term domestic violence and its consequences in her previous marriage were triggered in dealing with this mother-daughter relational conflicts. So in a way, this film is very interesting for gender studies and family studies scholars and students, but in other way, because the protagonist consider the risk of private life being judged by the public audience, holding conventional values against regarding domestic violence and abortion, miscarriage, family, and intimacy. So the mother decide to ban the screening out of the film. And for for the Mysore wheat harvest. And this very notorious controversy reflects a power struggle between the filmmaker and distribution participants and the protagonists and their supporters, like sex worker NGOs in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and feminist groups who intervened and banned screening in cinemas in these places. Basically, previous studies focused on the issue of informed consent, the invasion of sex workers' privacy, and endangerment of protagonists' lives through the exhibiting of the documentary and shifting power dynamics around representing sex workers by the filmmaker or by the sex workers themselves, or by sex worker NGOs or feminist groups, or by scholars, film scholars who want to discuss this film. So it's very complicated. From my feminist point of view, Wheat Harvest Mysore provides a very powerful on-screen portrait of a rural woman, gaining her independence and agency through sex work on the outskirts of Beijing, and her own subjectivity as a modern woman from the marginalized social status emerges through the images of her life traveling between rural hometown and urban Beijing. But you know, sex work is illegal in China, and participants are discriminated against by the public, which poses great legal risks, threats of gender-based violence and moral challenges for the protagonist, which I think the filmmaker and also distributor and the public, the film critics should take this worldly life needs in consideration to balance their desire of distributing the film. And also to remove, for example, for the filmmaker, remove protagonist detailed personal information from film, which is not a big issue to in terms of film narratives. Yeah, so I think also this controversy details the representation of oppressed in politics, using the political representation of the oppressed in politics, using the political logic of social activism and the practical goals of worldly life, might partially sacrifice the voice of the subject, and as in philosophy and in arts, or it's vice versa. So this controversy, I think, invites filmmakers to reflect on their care for their documented participants' worldly life. It also urges activists to problematize the political representation of the subject, therefore to discover and represent the voice of the deprived groups, as they can speak for themselves. Yes, and I would like also to mention a poem to Liu Xia, which was scripted by me and made by Trish McAdent, a short 3D animation, which was made with the motivation of representing Liu Xia as in arts and in politics. First of all, Liu Xia is a forbidden artist, for poet, photographer, and painter in China, and her art is very powerful in terms of expressing her resistance, even though she is not that kind of personality to speak in politics publicly. But sadly, she was often and until still now being presented in popular discourses, public discourses, NGOs, media, and merely as the wife of a political dissent, and then the widow of Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo, who passed away in 2017. While in this discourses, her own subjectivity has faded and even been erased from such kind of narratives. So I wrote the script and I used Liu Xia's own to photograph it, collaborating with visual artist Trish Margadent and her 3D animation team to represent Liu Xia as if she speaks for herself through her own art. First of all, as a forbidden artist, a victim and a survivor of political violence, and then the wife of Liu Xia, a widow of Liu Xiaobo. So, and also yeah, basically stopped here. Please follow, meet my work if you want to know more about my writing about women 15 minutes on the position of nonviolence. And also I will recommend you to read Ai Xiaoming's, my interview with Ai Xiaoming on the documentary film Gender and Activism in China, especially on the legacy of women activists being represented on screen, and how to ethnic minority and queer filmmakers Shito and Mingming to do queer community making through their visual work, and also my own visual work in Ukraine Whisper. To use, for example, in this photo, to use this image and animation and soundtrack to restage and represent the feelings and experience of gendered and political violence experience and trauma and healing. I will stop here now, and we will have full discussion during Q&A section. Thank you so much.
That was a very, very rich presentation. Looking forward to our discussion soon. Right. I'll introduce our third speaker, Bao Hongwei. So Dr. Bao Hongwei is Associate Professor in Media Studies at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He holds a PhD in Gender and Cultural Studies from the University of Sydney, Australia. He's the author of Queer Comrades, Queer China, Queer Media in China, and Contemporary Chinese Queer Performance. Very productive author. I'd like to invite Hongwei to start his presentation.
Sure. Let me share the slides first. So can everyone see my slides, hopefully? Okay, great. So thank Yun and Echo for organizing this great event, and also thank all the members and volunteers of CILENS. It's particularly difficult for queer documentaries and feminist documentaries and activism to exist in China, in particular in today's China. So that's why such opportunities of online discussions and in-person screenings, despite in a transnational and diasporic context, are particularly important. So far, our discussions have been mostly focused on feminist documentaries, and we have been using the term feminism and queer interchangeably and in conjunction with each other, with these good reasons, because issues of gender and sexuality are interrelated. We can't talk about gender without talking about sexuality, and vice versa. However, gender and sexuality have also got their own specificities. It's important to pay attention to the specificities of both feminist documentaries and queer documentaries. So my talk today will be focusing on queer documentary, and in particular, queer activist documentary or community documentary in contemporary China. So this actually comes from an article that I published in 2019, and later it's included in my latest book, Queer Media in China. So the title is called The Queer Generation, Queer Community Documentary in Contemporary China. And this is an open access article, so you can download the PDF simply by searching the queer generation, Hong Wei Bao, and so on. So what I will do today is I'll introduce the brief content of that article. I'm also going to make some connections with Yun Yun's talk and Jin Yan's talk by mentioning some of the shared characteristics of feminist documentaries and queer documentaries. So let's start from the definition. When I wrote the article in 2019, I was attempting to catch the history of queer movement in China, and I noticed the important role that cinema plays in the queer activist movement. And I call the kind of proliferation of queer community and activist documentaries and those activists who made them the queer generation. So when I was writing the article, the queer generation was primarily defined as the group that works around Beijing Queer Film Festival. So they know each other, they form a kind of film collective, they make queer films, and also they organize queer film events. And you use queer films as part of activism. From today's perspective, I think that queer generation, this term needs to be expanded to include, in a way, all queer filmmakers, cultural producers, and activists in post-Mao China, so which really uses their identity of queer to create artworks and cultural productions, and who articulate queer with issues of sexual identity, sexual rights, gender equality, and, in a way, freedom of expression. So we can use this term in a broad manner to refer to queer activism and those who are involved in queer cultural production and activism. So some of the most famous queer Chinese filmmakers include Cui Zi'en, who is a queer writer, activist, filmmaker, and critic. And he has written many short stories and long novels as well. So he has also created fiction films and documentaries. A lot of his fiction films are quite abstruse and they use kind of experimental and avant-garde aesthetics. But his documentaries are, in a way, more reader audience friendly. They use either the kind of historical footages to narrate China's queer community history, or they montage historical as well as fiction materials to create docudrama, so which is another type of fiction, non-fiction documentary, a non-fiction moving image. And the next person who is based in Berlin and who also went to this year's CILENS film screenings is Fan Pepe. Some of Fan Pepe's earlier films are documentary films working with queer communities. So, for example, he collaborated with P-Flag China and made the so-called Rainbow Family Trilogy, including Chinese Closet, Mama Rainbow, and Papa Rainbow. So those are about how queer children deal with the relationship with their parents and with their own identities, and how parents deal with their relationship with their children. So since Pepe moved to Berlin, he has produced some fiction films which deal with different issues of identity, intersectionality, and migration. So the films actually expand the understandings of identity and puts queer at the center of the discussion. And there's also Wei Jiangang and his Queer Comrade team. So Queer Comrade is basically a webcast or web broadcast. It's a streaming website. They made lots of videos, and a lot of these videos are documentaries, interviewing people from the queer communities or documenting queer community events. And I would call Queer Comrades so far the biggest or the largest queer community video archive in mainland China. So the website is still accessible. So you can visit the queercomrades.com website to watch some of their documentaries. And we mentioned Xu Tou and Ming Ming's artworks and their films. And they work together and produce many films, including Women 15 Minutes, which is a documentary about women's lives in different parts of China. And We Are Here, which was introduced earlier, which is a documentary about China's feminist movement, queer feminist movement after 1995. That film tries to explore the relationship between feminism and LGBT movement, between China's queer feminism and transnational feminism. So it's really an important and interesting film to watch. And He Xiaopei, who is an NGO worker, but she has also made many fascinating films. Her films puts women's desire at the center of the narrative. For example, in Bad Women of China, you might have heard of Good Women of China, which projects kind of Orientalist imagination of what Chinese woman might be. But Bad Women of China is kind of autobiographical narrative of 3 generations of women's stories. So her story, her mother's story, and her daughter's story. So it seems that they all, in a way, depart from the normative gender norms defined for Chinese women and by patriarchal society. And they pursue their desire, freedom, and so on. He Xiaopei's film is a good example of how a queer feminist filmmaker puts her own subjectivity or their own subjectivity into the film, because a lot of these films are highly biographical and autobiographical. And then there are other filmmakers such as Yang, who also started the Beijing Queer Film Festival and who made a documentary about the 10-year journey of the Beijing Queer Film Festival called Our Story. And Wei Tingting, one of the Feminist Five, made a documentary about By China. Yu Yun has analyzed By China, but I want to say one thing, that By China is very poetic, very beautiful film. It highlights women's bisexual men and women's own experiences. It's also goes beyond the terrains of factual documentation, and there's a lot of stream of consciousness being expressed through either intertitles or the protagonist narratives. So I think it's important to look at the sociology of the queer media production. So in my book, Queer Media in China, what I primarily did was to look at the kind of production, consumption, and circulation of the queer independent documentaries and their social and political implications. So as you might know, that both feminist films and queer films are automatically banned or censored in China. So they can't enter mainstream cinema or can't be screened on mainstream television and so on. So that's why they're mostly independent productions. Because of their independent productions, they take on certain aesthetics and political stance. And they were made through independent means. When I say independently, I meant they were mostly funded by the filmmakers themselves, their friends, the NGOs or foundations and so on. So they highlight a kind of politically active as well as financially or commercially negative stance. So they argue against the mainstream or dominant mode of cultural production and highlight their financial independence as well as their political independence. And then there is a circulation because of the restrictions and because of the particular production mode. And these films or those videos are mostly circulated through underground channels, for example, through people-to-people networks or group-to-group networks, and sometimes through, for example, online streaming and bootleg DVD and so on. So they were screened in university classrooms, cafes, community centers, and so on. Although in recent years, the screening environment has become more and more difficult. But the international platforms such as Cathay Films, as well as the film events that was organized by CILENS, provided some of the screening and circulation possibilities for independent Chinese feminist and queer films. So a lot of these films highlight issues of identity, community, health, and rights, or particularly relevant to LGBTQ people. And apart from speaking to communities, many of the filmmakers also try to communicate with the public to promote same-sex rights or understanding of sexuality. And the aesthetics of many of those documentaries, as mentioned earlier, tend to be slightly mainstream. That is, they, in a way, copied the kind of mainstream broadcasting techniques, such as talking heads and group interviews and so on. However, there are also experimental techniques and aesthetics explored. Most importantly, in those films, the filmmakers' subjectivities are particularly clear. So I think earlier Yun talked about the importance, both Yun and Jingyan talked about the importance of the authorial inscription in documentary filmmaking. And this has its historical background in China. So in China, because it's a particular trajectory of independent documentary, a lot of documentarians have used a kind of drawn on direct cinema or cinema verite tradition, portray the people or the event as they are, in inverted commas. So in other words, the fly on the wall mode of observational documentary has become the dominant paradigm in Chinese independent cinema. What queer and feminist documentaries or documentarians did was to break away this notion of objectivity. They try to insert themselves into the films, into the historical event, and into the filmed event. And this has particular relevance. And they challenge the so-called universalism or universal objectivity, highlighting that every perspective is necessarily a subjective experience or subjective perspective, and this subjectivity needs to be acknowledged. So I'm conscious of the time. I'll probably just stop here, and I'm happy to answer more questions about queer and feminist documentaries. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Hongwei. And 辛苦了 our translator volunteers who are like constantly typing the text. Thanks, Hongwei, and thanks, Jian. I feel that the three of us have really approached the topic from different angles. I will give the audience some time. If you have questions or comments, if you have your own experiences to share about your viewing of documentary or making documentary in China from feminist or queer point of view, or you have any questions addressing to the last three speeches you've heard, you can then send Echo Town your question. So while we are collecting questions, I want to maybe just invite Jingyan and Hongwei to talk a bit more about the connection between our three different presentations. Jingyan, I was wondering whether what do you think about the definition of feminist documentary. And I'm very curious about your view of how to define, or whether there's a need to define feminist documentary.
For me, definition probably even for the word documentary film, I don't want to defend it because I like all this experiment experience of video expression, which in a way, even though it's creative, reflexive, but more like more closer to the reality, the whole big picture reality, the society of we are living in. And also particularly I would like to mention, because actually in our three presentations, I think we already talked to each other in a way, because you emphasized on the feminist and LGBTQ plus documentary filmmaking, not only do observational documentation, which is critical, I think, in a way of, because first of all, documentary film making is about the relationship between the person in front of the camera and behind the camera. So I will say, and also Hongwei also points out, compared to previous generation of independent cinema movement, independent documentary movement, we can see feminist documentary filmmaking and LGBTQ plus documentary filmmaking. We emphasize more on the more reflexive and interactive way of filmmaking, which means we are not the eyes of God. The camera to watch what's happening in front of our camera, but also we treat our protagonist or characters as equally creatively, not only equal partners, not only in terms of rights, but also in terms of creativity partnership. So this particular point, even though everyone already talked about it, I would like to emphasize. And also, this is also my reason I don't want to defend feminist documentary filmmaking, because once when a filmmaker or the protagonist won't express themselves, first of all, it's about self-expression. They will find a way to express the reality, the situation, the dilemma, and the solution in the documentary film, in the film. Yes.
Hongwei, do you agree with that? We don't need.
Sure, I agree. So I want to highlight one point that Jinyan already said, which is this collaborative authorship and participatory mode of filmmaking. So although most of the time we see somebody made this film, for example, Fan Po made Mama Rainbow or Shi Tou Mei Within 50 Minutes, these films should be more appropriately seen as collaborative productions between the filmmakers and the communities, and how the filmmakers establish connections, relationalities with the filmed subjects, and eventually, actually, this becomes a documentation of their shared memories. And when those films are screened in screening venues and with the audiences, these become shared experiences and creating a type of queer public space within the screening communities. So that's particularly important.
Yes, sorry, I want to add one point from the filmmaking perspective. I know today we have quite a lot of audiences who are interested in film production or filmmaking. It also raised a question in documentary filmmaking. As always, who owns the image? Who have the right to edit or interpret their images? So I think this more collaborative approach of documentary filmmaking also reflects very much feminist ideas, visions.
Yeah, Jia, exactly on that issue, we have one question from the audience Sorry, I got lost somewhere. The question was exactly about the subjects included in the films. They still carry the status of minorities, either sexual minorities or in terms of their gender, they're marked as women. In a way that the audience was asking whether there is actual a way that's realistically possible to not to other them, to not to see them as the others. I mean, we mentioned some quite idealistic principle of treating them as equals, equally creative, equally full of agency and empowerment. But the fact of filming them itself, this action, can it actually circumvent the possibility of othering them? So that's the question from the audience.
I don't have a very concrete answer for this question, but this is always a question I think every filmmaker and producer should bear in mind. I can share some of the experience. First is, for example, on Yang Lina and Zhang Zanbo's case, on the films about the extramarital relationship, they share their footage, show the footage to their protagonist, and then to involve them in different stages of editing. But also, we need to realize that everyone has very different perception about their self. Other than, I mean, when, for example, the film about labor movement I produced, We the Workers, when our protagonists saw their on-screen image, they were kind of shocking. Because for us, we need to use, we need to consider cinematic experience of audience and also our access to footage. So the presentation on screen of this labor movement is around the first protagonist was like not the first most important, so-called most important leader in the movement, because we choose someone who worked in different organizations and visiting different activists and workers home, and also to link all the social political spaces through his personal movement, which is quite good cinematic quality. But for many activists or some protagonists, they expect they are the first leading cast or leading character. So for me, my strategy is I need to always spend time, a lot of time with our protagonists or characters to communicate with each other, to help each other to achieve some kind of understanding on our life, and then it's really not like when I meet you, I turn on my camera and shoot it. It's like a mutual understanding and mutual interaction. And after we finish the editing, I even need to spend time to help or reflect on the so-called the socially constructed image of the protagonist, or understanding of their identity, not like only self-projection of a hero on screen, etc. So that it takes a lot of work. And as I said, it's always the relationship between the filmmaker and the protagonist. And I will say that we always encourage, in a way it's possible, like the protagonist, they film themselves and use this footage in the film. Yeah, this is not a concrete answer, but it's just some reflections.
Definitely. And we should mention that a lot of the filmmakers in China's feminist and queer movements themselves, they belong to the group. So in a way, this kind of affinity, I find it important to help with the communication and the more egalitarian, even partnership between the filmmakers and protagonists. Hongwei, I actually, before moving on to audience questions, I had a question about the kind of internal inequalities between within China's queer documentary cinema. This has been well documented that female filmmakers in the entire industry is disadvantaged, and even within the queer community, lesbian and female bisexual filmmakers and artists are also disadvantaged in a way. Have you seen, do you confirm this, and do you have any explanations, and do you see this changing in the last decade, since that we have, all of us, three of us, have given quite some female directors' works, but I don't want the audience to have misbelief that the production is completely, how to say, comparable or in a very equal way. So I think we should address this inequality within the feminist and queer community.
Yep, absolutely. So the gender and sexual inequalities exist in society, and this gets reproduced through technological means and so on. So that's why we probably see more gay identified filmmakers, gay men identified filmmakers, and lesbian or bisexual or trans identified filmmakers. But I also want to actually point out some nuances. So acknowledging this narrative and acknowledging this inequality, and it seems that people are tackling with the issues, we need to pay attention to some nuances. The first nuance is that there were actually, in Chinese film history, there were a lot of female filmmakers, in particular, actually, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, because of China's historical reasons. So a lot of these female filmmakers, their films, although do not explicitly have a feminist or queer agenda, some of them, for example, Yang Lina and so on, they highlight their gender sexual subjectivities, which can be seen as precursors of feminist films or queer films. So I think Wang Linzhen Lao's recent book is a good example and offers a really nice reading of Chinese women's cinema. And the second aspect is that queer and Chinese documentaries of independent filmmaking mostly emerged in China in the 1990s and early 2000s. This historical period is important because it corresponds with technological changes from celluloid camera to digital camera. So of course, in the past, there has been a kind of technological disadvantage for women to become filmmakers, but with the technological affordances and its portability and so on, so relatively fewer more women filmmakers have started to pick up camera and represent themselves. So in a way, this technological affordance has pushed sexual and gender minorities, women and men, to represent themselves. And now we see more trans representations. So yes, there are structural constraints, but there are always things happening.
Yeah. Jian, are you with us?
Yeah. Because Hongwei mentioned about structural restraints, so I would just want to simply point out one point that actually we had quite a lot of very good women or female sexual minority, so-called minority filmmakers are making very good film, but in the Chinese sphere, I think there are not enough or very limited opportunity and critics of distributions of documentary films on gender issue. For example, Zhang Zanbo's A Sort of Love, maybe. I saw a very good sample, a very good film portrait of a so-called leftover women in China. But when he hardly had the chance to screen the film in China, and when the film was managed to screen on limited spaces for the Chinese independent documentary community, some critical filmmakers and critics just saying that, why making a film on such a not important, petty issue, etc. So I think that there's one very important job for us, for everyone here today, including our audience and the curators, to do distribution and critic work on gender films. Thank you. That's the structure, the issue I want to address as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Following Jin Yan, I would also talk. Jin Yan's example is Zhang Zanbo, and today we also talked about examples from Fan Pe, for example. Some of Fan Pe's film highlight a very strong feminist stance. For example, the China monologues, and then there's also Yu Xiuhua's the documentary about Yu Xiuhua, Still Tomorrow, 摇摇晃晃的人间. So I think that in this particular context, I think that it is important to recognize that in a way, sometimes feminist documentary or feminist politics is also a type of politics regardless of gender and sexual identities. It is about how you align yourself with a particular politics and how films are used to articulate that politics.
Definitely, I find both Hongwei and Jia's comments very valuable. And in the audience, even if you feel you're not so much of a film director yet, which you might become one day, but all of us have the possibility to watch these films, to distribute, to share with friends, to comment on them on Douban, on different social media, to share within the community. All of those recognition will help directors to then further have their films being seen. So I think there are many things we can all do. So I have some questions from the audience. First one from Kao Ying Chao. Thanks for the wonderful panel. May I ask, how do documentary makers in China obtain the interlocutors' signatures on the informed consent forms and protect their personal safety while they're facing the issues of identification, like coming out, as well as governmental surveillance and possible police harassment? Thank you.
Can I ask Jin Yan to answer this question because she has more experience?
So I will just share some cases, and yeah, you can add later. So this question is very critical question and also very controversial question for many filmmakers, and in a way, traditionally. So according to my limited knowledge on this ethical, informed consent and the ethical issue and the political risk control, I think in the 1990s and 2000s, we don't see very often to use signed document, right, for the informed consent, because once in Chinese society, the way Chinese people's way of interacting with each other, as long as you take out paper after someone to write down their formal informed consent, it will be really difficult and change the relationship between the filmmaker and the protagonist also, because so I can see more nuanced way of developing informed consent and also developing procedural consent. It's as I mentioned before, to for example, my collaborator, he lived with his protagonist for quite a long time to filming his film, which is quite often a practice for many other filmmakers. And I would mention particularly for we the workers, I worked with NGOs, lawyers, filmmakers, film critics, and also some of the protagonists, particularly on political risk control, to make sure, I mean, not on the condition of, when we select and analyze the footage, make sure it won't be an evidence of criminalized our protagonist. And also we can, this limitation is very interesting because of this limitation forced us to think more, or to do it more in a more creative way, to express the same topic, same thing, or same message without expose our protagonist to political risk. And distribution control is a very important strategy for many filmmakers, not only on political issue, but also on like a morally controversial issue, etc. And for me, I use educational distribution channel, which means through this way, the film will be screened and discussed in a more safe environment or constructive environment. And also we use a lot of strategy of preview with protagonists, preview with professionals, preview with legal experts to make sure the film won't, nobody can do 100% guaranteeing, but to make sure the film is developed and released in an ethical way. I know many people will argue this part, saying that this will limit the artist's creativity. I don't think so, because documentary film is about the real presence, real life in the real world. So we need to be very strict on ethical issue and legal political risk control. And if there are limitations, we definitely, that's the job for the artist and filmmaker to be creative. That's what I can say.
Yeah, I just want to add one short comment on this, since I also started to practice documentary filmmaking this year. I feel it's not about one letter, one consent form they sign. It's not a one-time thing. Actually, the consent gaining process is ongoing, is constant. It should last not only before, it should not only happen before the filmmaking, but during the whole process of filmmaking, and until it would be a continued. Even when the film is finished, it's in distribution, it's being viewed. I think the subjects have the rights all the time to withdraw, to revise, or to advise the filmmakers. And especially when certain sensitive or very private scenes are just being filmed, I think it's always a good practice to then play those footages to the subjects and ask them how do they feel about it. Are they what do they think about using this in the final film? I think that's at least what I have learned in my practice. I have maybe one, two, maybe at most 3 different questions. I think we have to close it before it gets too late in Beijing time, and our volunteers are also doing a lot of work for us. One question from Joanna: how is the issue of the limitation of circulation of documentary in China being addressed? The fundamental goal of documentary is to reach a large audience, to evoke awareness and understanding and empathy. And I guess the question is, if the distribution and viewing, as Hongwei mentioned, is very much within the communities, semi-private, and it inherently limits its impact, and how do we understand that?
Okay, so can I answer this question? This is a great question. So definitely in China, the queer and feminist documentaries are very restricted in terms of circulation. So things that could be done in the past, for example, university classroom screenings, we used to be able to organize university screenings on campus in China, but now it's increasingly difficult or even impossible. However, I think that in a way, filmmakers and curators are very creative. I have recently read an article on China's short film festivals. In China, there are lots of youth film festivals or short film festivals. These film festivals are not called queer film festivals, but they have a lot of queer films or a lot of feminist films. This is because short films do not have to be sent for censorship approval. So, and the category of short films is extremely elastic. A 5-minute film is a short film, and a 1-hour film can also be called a short film. So in other words, people are experimenting with different screening possibilities. Or of course, another screening possibility is screening on social media, on TikTok or on Bilibili and so on. So a lot of these films are not explicitly carrying the label of feminism and queer theory, but they may have a strong message to carry. Yeah, so these are some of the innovations I find, but eventually I think that the environment is not queer or feminist friendly, and this seriously restricts circulation.
I would like to also briefly mention, because back to the 1990s, even during the Mao's era, even though it's always this censorship, etc., but still, for example, there's apartment art spaces, which means there's a concept called apartment art, which means the artist, the filmmaker, they use their apartment as a place for exhibition and discussion and circulation. And also in the 1990s, it's quite popular to have dinner screening at filmmakers' home, and they watch the film, have dinner gathering, and have discussions. And also in the 2000s, I think it's quite popular to just simply print out DVD copies and distribute in the filmmakers and intellectuals personal network. And even consider that I was with Lao Ma Ti Hua during the Sichuan earthquake. This DVD, because at that time he was very careful about the illegal business suspect to be so upon request, netizens' request, the Ioway's studio sent out 100,000 copies of DVD copies of Lao Ma Ti Hua to netizens who would pay the delivery fee themselves upon arrival. So, and always remember, we have a kind of a subculture or counter-public culture weight of space and weight of communication, even though at this moment we don't know what is exactly new things coming out yet, but I trust this is smart.
Definitely. Sometimes semi-private spaces can also be a very powerful, very empowering community for the so-called alternative space or counter-public. Echo, I believe you collected some questions.
Yeah, actually I've received a few, but since we have limited time, I would ask two. So one of the participants said, I didn't even know that there are so many feminist and queer films feminist films in China, where can I find these feminist films? Also, you know, in the future, in the long term, I think Ming has actually done a great job before the webinar while working on the preparation for that, creating a sort of film list that could be an open source document to be shared, to be even collaborated. So maybe you can, take the floor.
Yeah, I started building this film list, and I want to invite the audience today to join our kind of collaborative film list making practice, since it's we have like scholars like Hong Wei and also Jin Yan who research, and they also do their own films. So they have done a lot of kind of review and analyzing in ongoing kind of a process. So if you're interested, you can always contact us. We can then continue this research together. And I think it would be great to have a Doudan kind of published, accessible for all the audience. And I have compiled about maybe 20 to 30, and there are many more to add. And about access, I think Hong Wei and Jin Yan might both have something to say. I personally find that Play, the platform that we're collaborating with, a quite good collection for both feminist themed and queer themed, and both fiction and non-fiction films. That's also, I guess, echo why we have chosen this platform to collaborate with, to screen our 3 selected queer films online. So we can put the address in the chat box so that the audience know where to access them. It's not free, but it's a quite affordable membership fee, I find. And I think the collection is also quite good. Hong Wei and Jin Yan, do you have something, advice for the audience? Where can they find films?
I think Hong Wei will talked about his current on CIFA later. Because CIFA is a very good resources center to get access to almost all the independent documentary films in China so far. The research centers can collect, and many important independent documentary films can be found in university libraries, archives, which in the USA and in Europe, mostly the situation, especially for my educational distributor based in New York. They have a collection called the Generate Films, which all Chinese independent films, and they distribute more than 15,000 films. Most of them educational institutions. During pandemic, these universities and research centers changed the way of getting access to independent films by subscribing to the collection rather than to buy individual films. So which means if you have a library card, public library card, probably you can access to many. And also some of the which met in early times, like in the 1990s and 2000s, they already were released on YouTube. I don't know whether it's legal or not illegal, but yeah, there are quite a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Jin Yan. I put in the chat the name of CIFA, 华语独立影像资料. Actually, today's panel webinar with the video should be uploaded there afterwards for your reference. And I also uploaded the articles that Hong Wei's talk is very much built upon. So Hong Wei's 2019 article on queer generation, and also the latest 华语独立电影观察, where Jin Yan's article it has been published. So both publications are free for you to download, and if you want to read more of Hong Wei and Jin Yan's publications. So Echo, questions?
Yeah, maybe the last question. So this is a question from a Chinese participant. I will read the question in Chinese first, and then I will just read the English one so everybody could understand. So this participant asks, 请问各位老师会给想投身于中国女权或性少数权益行动的年轻人一句什么样的话呢？任何建议、感想都可以。So basically, this participant wants to know if all of our speakers could just quickly share a few words to those young Chinese who wish to, engage actively in either the feminist agenda or the LGBTQ community or movement in China. Anything as in the form of suggestion or thought?
I can start. 我可以先说，我想说的是找到你的组织，然后永远都不是一个人。I say that because finding your organization sometimes, or finding a community takes some time, and you might feel you are a bit different or alone. I think it took me a long time to find feminist researchers network that share my own interest to do research on gender and politics in China. And as a Chinese living abroad in this kind of diaspora circle, it takes a lot of efforts and initiatives to find people that have similar life experiences. So that's my personal kind of, I guess, advice.
Okay, so it's a really difficult question, but I would say that your identity is important, but it's not the only thing that matters. Pay attention to other types of identities that are socially marginalized and work with them. 那么基本上我想要说的是，从事女权还有从事酷儿的，当然是你的性跟性别身份是很重要的，但是其他的身份也同样非常重要。比如说我们还有很多没有看到的，比如说残疾人的问题，或者是民工的问题，还有什么叫移民的问题等等，像这些问题同样应该注意。那么就看一下这些问题是怎么样跟性跟性别相交织在一起的。性跟性别呢，可以作为一个视角，用这个视角来看很多的问题。
谢谢云云和宏伟。我本来也想说找到你的社群的，因为这样就是说不会感觉孤独，而且在社群里面会受到各种启发，其实是蛮棒的。包括现在有在线的社群，像女权学论哈，然后还有平时参加这些活动都会遇到很多的朋友，但是现在目前的这个情况下呢，我会说，就是把你自己的生活过得很精彩，然后你自己就会找到很多有意思的跟这个议题有关的有贡献的事情。对 ，It's just my personal experience. Thank you. 我需要不要在英文再说一遍，还是就？No, OK, thank you.
好的，那现在北京时间已经差不多晚上9点50，然后我们也聊了将近快2个小时。Wait， 我们刚才有一位观众提问过，就是高颖潮，he says. A response from Taiwanese experience, join an activist community if you can find one. If you can't find an existing activist community, build your own. That's also very good advice. Right, I think that concludes our webinar today. I learned a lot from Hongwei and Xinyan, and I think it's a great practice that we are bringing the subject of documentary to the discussion of social movements. I think the two definitely need each other. And thank you very much, Echo, for giving us this opportunity and to combine screening with more intellectual scholarly discussions and interactions with audience from, I guess, all over the world. And personally, it's a very enriching experience for me.
Thank you for your work, and thank you, Hong and Jingyan, for your time and work and intellectual and emotional input. That really means a lot to everyone, I think. Should we take a selfie together?
How do
Before you go?
Sure.
Thank you
So,
so much.
Echo, do you mean selfie with the four of us? So
Oh, I mean, with everyone who is willing to turn on their camera, right?
yeah,
That would be wonderful.
yeah, sure. If you want a selfie with us, you can turn on your camera. Lisa, thanks. 肖博能看到你们。
okay, I'll do this now.
Joanna, thanks for asking.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great organizing work.
Thank you. And the video will be uploaded to CIFA. And please don't hesitate to contact us if you have questions. And if you want to join the collaboration of the making of the feminist. Bye bye. 晚安大家。
Have a nice summer. Bye.
Bye. Thanks very much.